Welcome back to my review of A Conscious Universe by Almando Calvo. Today we'll be looking at chapters 5 and 6. If you're looking for my earlier installments, you'll find links in the description. In chapter 5, titled Once Upon a Time, Mr. Calvo argues that God is not just a fantasy or a fairy tale. He explains how God is different from Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy, saying the main difference is that God is supported by evidence. After giving an obligatory recitation of the cosmological and teleological arguments, he gets down to historical evidence, mostly about Jesus. The discussion of Jesus continues on in chapter 6, so it made sense for me to deal with these two chapters together. We begin with descriptions of Santa and the Tooth Fairy.
Santa Claus is a character used for the Christmas holiday and serves the purpose of mysterious magic and gifts for the good boys and girls. The Tooth Fairy, as we all know, plays a major role in our childhood for the purpose of allowing kids to have a better experience with losing their baby teeth.
Calvo comments that
God is not a character used like a fairy tale character is used. God is not a plug-in for the gaps in our knowledge. Instead, God is the explanation of why anything exists at all.
Now, I didn't come here to compare belief in God with belief in Santa or the Tooth Fairy, because those are things that are only believed by children, and the implication is that believing in God is also childish. That's an aggressive, insulting tactic, and it's not an argument I would ordinarily make. But, since you brought it up, there are some similarities. The Santa Claus story teaches children that someone is keeping track of their good and bad behavior, even when no one seems to be looking. It reassures them that somebody appreciates their efforts to be good and will reward them appropriately at a later time. Is it not obvious that the God story offers exactly the same reassurance to adults? And losing a tooth can be scary for a kid. There's some pain or discomfort, there's a little blood, and you're losing something you've had since you were a baby. That's all very weird for a child. The notion that some magical person will offer you comfort in this time of loss makes the whole thing feel less cruel and arbitrary. Must I point out that people turn to God in times of pain for basically the same reasons? So yeah, there are similarities. The difference, I guess, is that there are formal arguments for the existence of God, and Calvo does offer a couple of those. He starts with the cosmological argument, which he restates as follows.
Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe had a cause. The universe makes up three core values to exist: time, space, and matter. Whatever caused the universe can't be held together by the same core values in order to exist, because it caused those core values to exist. The cause must be spaceless, timeless, powerful, personal, intelligent, moral, and alive.
This seems to me very similar to the phrasing made famous by apologist William Lane Craig.
Timeless, spaceless, immaterial being of unfathomable power. Moreover, it must be personal as well.
And I'm tempted to say Mr. Calvo should give credit here. But maybe this argument has been repeated so often that he considers it the common property of all Christian apologists. I myself have certainly echoed points that have been made by other would-be philosophers on YouTube, though I make an effort to restate the points in my own words. This particular argument has been thoroughly debunked, in my opinion, by others on YouTube, notably Prophet of Zod, and I will include a link in the description. Nevertheless, I have committed to refuting each argument myself, so here goes. Mr. Calvo, or Dr. Craig, starts by asserting that whatever begins to exist has a cause. This feels like common sense because, of course, everything has to be caused by something. What is the alternative? Things just popping into existence without cause or explanation? But I would argue that there's some sleight of hand here. Whatever begins to exist, what have we actually observed beginning to exist? Everything that looks to us like a beginning is really just a change in form. A seed grows into a flower. A baby takes shape in the mother's womb, but the matter and energy in the universe remains constant. The argument talks about things beginning to exist as if this is something we understand, we know how this works, and we can rely on common sense. But we don't know anything about how things come to exist. We don't know if that's even a thing. Moreover, when any event occurs, as far as I know, there's never a singular cause. Rather, there's always a complex set of conditions leading to the event. What's the cause of a flower growing? The seed, and the soil, and the rain, and the climate, the temperature, the air, the sun. All the causes we know about are like that. Multiple factors combine to produce a new form of the matter and energy that already exist. This supposed common sense statement that everything begins to exist and has a singular cause is really assuming something like the theistic model. If you want to know how the universe began, you can't figure it out using common sense about how things usually work. We have no idea how universes usually come to exist. If you want to say it was caused by something, okay, fine. Some phenomenon or set of conditions led to the existence of the universe. But that doesn't mean the cause of the universe is a singular force, a being of great power, or any of the other nonsense asserted in this argument. The way logical reasoning is supposed to work is that you input your premises and logic spits out a conclusion. Whatever begins has a cause. The universe began. The universe had a cause. But this argument treats a syllogism like a slot machine, putting out a jackpot of attributes of God: timeless, spaceless, powerful, personal, intelligent, living, moral. But maybe time and space are eternal and pre-existent. If so, nothing is timeless or spaceless. A purposeful creation would imply a powerful, personal, intelligent creator, but how can you show it was purposeful? As for morality, I've argued in my previous videos that this is a product of biological and cultural evolution. There's no need to trace its origins back billions of years to the beginning of the universe. Maybe our universe is one of many, situated within a larger cosmos. Maybe the phenomenon that led to the spawning of our universe was not a singular force, but some complex set of conditions beyond our imagining. I know apologists see it as a weakness that we're reduced to saying maybe this, maybe that, but really, why should we expect to know the ultimate causes of time, space, and being? Why would that be something that we could just figure out using logic puzzles, semantics, word games? The apologist claims that the universe must be caused, and the cause must have all the traditional attributes of God. These are little more than a series of assertions masquerading as an argument. And the so-called teleological argument, a fancy name for the argument from design, is no better. I've devoted some time to this in my earlier videos, so I won't belabor it here. The basic idea is that just as a painting needs a painter and a building needs a builder, creation needs a creator. But this is just assuming, again, that the universe was created purposefully, which is exactly the question we're trying to answer. Having trotted out these standard boilerplate arguments, Mr. Calvo is satisfied that he has established God's existence. So he moves on now to his next task, determining which God we ought to be worshiping. In other words, he will be arguing
the historical reliability for Jesus Christ.
The remainder of this video will be devoted to that evidence. Calvo's case for Christ comprises 5 categories: the testimony of historians, the manuscript tradition, archaeology, blasphemy, and prophecy. I will deal with each of these in turn. We start with a list of extra-biblical sources reporting on the existence of Jesus. It's a familiar list. Lots of apologists have trotted out this list, and it's been debunked a dozen times. I like Paulogia's video on this topic, and will provide a link in the description. But in short, Tacitus, writing about the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE, says, Nero fastened the guilt on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, or Christ, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition again broke out. So this is a 2nd century historian reporting that someone called Christ, which is a title, not a name, died under Pilate while Tiberius reigned, a period of 23 years. Okay, so this is generally consistent with the gospel account, but it doesn't prove anything. Tacitus is writing some 80 years after the death of Jesus. By this time, the Gospels have been circulating for 30, 40 years. There's no indication that Tacitus has checked and verified these details. He's just documenting the story that's going around. Now, I'm not particularly skeptical about the claim that Jesus was a real person, he was born, and he was crucified. Lots of 1st century Jews were crucified. It's not hard to believe. If you could prove he lived and died, it wouldn't prove he was a prophet, a Messiah, or a god. I'm just saying this quote from Tacitus doesn't prove anything. Next, Pliny the Younger writes, Christians were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, when they sang in alternate verses a hymn to Christ as to a god, and bound themselves by a solemn oath not to do any wicked deeds. This quote doesn't even make a claim about a historical Jesus. This is, again, somebody writing 80 years after Christ reportedly died, saying that Christians worship him like a god. It doesn't say when he lived, when he died, anything he said or did. Just that Christians like him, a point I am happy to grant. Josephus mentions this James, the brother of Jesus, the so-called Christ. Josephus, at least, is living closer to the time of the events we're talking about. He was born after Jesus died, but at least some eyewitnesses might still have been alive. So is this evidence that Jesus existed and he had a brother? Sure. It's not proof, but it's evidence. Josephus allegedly also said, about this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man. He was the Christ. Now there's broad consensus among scholars that Josephus didn't really say this. Josephus was a Jewish author. If he had really thought Jesus was the Christ, or the Messiah, he presumably would have become a Christian, but he didn't. So it's likely that these words were inserted by later Christian editors monkeying with the text. Remember, we don't have the original manuscripts of any of this stuff. All these documents were copied over and over by hand for generations. So there were plenty of opportunities for Christian scribes to make sure every published work conformed to their narrative. Now, even if we take the giant leap and assume Josephus said this, it wouldn't give us any additional information about who Jesus was, what he did, or why we should believe. It would only show that Josephus himself was a believer, which he wasn't. It appears that Calvo read up on this, but he didn't understand what he read. Calvo comments,
Josephus was not a Christian, and it is difficult to believe that anyone but a Christian would have made some of these statements. The way he describes Jesus is as if he himself believed him to be more than a man, but a god.
Right. But Mr. Calvo seems to be suggesting this is a testament to the miraculous nature of Christ, that he would inspire even a Jew to speak of him in these glowing terms, when in fact, he's explaining why scholars regard this passage as spurious. Next, we get a pair of authors, Thallus and Phlegon, who probably lived in the 1st and 2nd century. Their writings are all lost, but we know about them because some Christians in the 3rd century were interested in what they had to say about an eclipse. Julius Africanus wrote, "On the whole world there pressed a most fearful darkness. This darkness Thallus, in the 3rd book of his history, calls, as appears to me without reason, an eclipse of the sun." And Phlegon records that in the time of Tiberius Caesar, at full moon, there was a full eclipse of the sun from the 6th to the 9th hour. That's it. Nothing about Jesus. They said there was an eclipse. This is supposed to be significant because the Gospels say darkness fell upon the land at the moment Jesus was crucified. So this stuff about an eclipse is supposed to corroborate the story. But there's nothing in the text that says when these eclipses took place, what day, what month, or even what year. Phlegon says it was during the reign of Tiberius, which gives us a reign of 23 years. Do I even have to point out how weak this is? Hundreds of years after Jesus died, a Christian author is digging through old books to find out if anyone said anything about an eclipse. And he's informing us, yep, I found it. Proof of the crucifixion darkness. We don't get to see these books for ourselves, read what Thales and Phlegon wrote, determine if it has anything to do with the crucifixion at all. Finally, Mara Bar Serapion writes, what benefit did the Athenians obtain by putting Socrates to death? Or the people of Samos for burning Pythagoras? Or the Jews by murdering their wise king? The wise king lived on in the teachings he enacted. This is slightly interesting. Our copy of this letter dates back to the 6th or 7th century, but some scholars think the original may have been written around 73 CE, which would make it as old as the earliest gospel. But other scholars think it may be from the 2nd or 3rd century. Either way, the writer is passing along a story that the Jews murdered a wise king. Is he talking about Jesus? Maybe. Or maybe he means somebody else. Either way, he's obviously just repeating a story that he's heard. He doesn't claim to have first-hand knowledge of Socrates or Pythagoras or the wise Jewish king. He's not an eyewitness. Bar Serapion's letter is interesting because if it really is as old as the Gospels, it gives us a clue as to what people were saying at the time. Notably, he doesn't mention anything about miracles or magic or rising from the dead. He says a Jewish king was killed and that he was wise. To sum up, 60, 70, 80 years after Jesus died, some historians wrote down what people were saying about him. That he had a brother, that he was killed, that his followers sang songs about him. There was an eclipse sometime, and some Christians said that was because of him, and other people said, no, it wasn't. From this, Calvo draws the conclusion,
there has never been so much evidential information for a historical character than what we have for Jesus Christ. Jesus' impact was greater than any other man who had walked the earth.
Next, Calvo talks about the manuscript tradition. He says,
there is more manuscript evidence that supports the accuracy and validity of the Bible's reliability than any other document in history.
Citing the Institute for Creation Research as his source, Calvo quotes the familiar statistic that there are some 6,000 Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. Now, a lot of these manuscripts are copies that were made many centuries after the time of Jesus. And a lot of the older ones are not really manuscripts at all, but little scraps and fragments. But even if we grant that there are a lot of ancient manuscripts, I never understand why the sheer number of manuscripts is offered by apologists as evidence of the Bible's reliability. The fact that we have thousands of ancient copies attests to the dedication of the early church and generations of monks and scribes who essentially spent their lives copying the Bible over and over. So yeah, they produced a lot of Bibles. But what is that supposed to prove? If our oldest manuscripts of the New Testament are true, then the thousands of copies are just as true, except for scribal errors and textual variations. But if the oldest manuscripts are full of errors or legends or lies, copying them over 6,000 times won't make them any more true. Apologists like Mr. Calvo spend inordinate effort trying to prove these books are old, when they should be trying to prove the books are true. No one is doubting the Bible is pretty old. It's not like the Book of Mormon, where a 19th century document is claimed to be copied from an ancient tablet, and we have to determine whether the text is old. We get it. The Bible is old. But stories about Jesus were being told for something like 40 years before our earliest gospel writer, Mark, wrote them down. The oldest copies we have are from a century later. So the stories were already passed down for generations before we ended up with anything like the Bible we have. There's literally no way to know what the first century of gospel manuscripts looked like, or how the stories changed during those first 40 years of oral tradition, or how accurately any of it records the real historical Jesus. Next, Calvo says,
there have been several important discoveries through biblical archaeology that confirm and verify the reliability of the Bible.
He mentions a few examples, none of which pertain to the New Testament. The Teldon Stela, which was discovered in 1993, references the house of David. Calvo also says the Teldon confirms the Assyrian invasion of Jerusalem in the 700s BCE. This appears to be incorrect, but there is other extra-biblical evidence for this invasion. And silver scrolls were discovered recording the benediction from the Book of Numbers. I can't imagine what any of this is supposed to prove. First of all, this is all Hebrew Bible stuff, nothing about Jesus. Second of all, these are all mundane details. There really was a battle. Some ancient Hebrews really said they were descended from someone named David. They really did say the blessings they say they said. None of this supports the extraordinary claims made in the Bible. Those claims aren't even mentioned. If you listen to Apologia, you've surely heard the Spider-Man analogy. It goes something like this. If sometime in the future historians found the Spider-Man stories, and they were trying to figure out if the stories are true, they might see all the references to New York City and say, hey, New York City is a real place. If they counted that as evidence of a historical Spider-Man, that would be the same logic that leads apologists to think the discovery of ancient Nazareth is evidence of the historical Jesus. Of course, this example is silly. It's purposefully silly, because it's intended to demonstrate how silly it is to make these kinds of assumptions. But to take a somewhat less silly example, how about the Trojan War? Archaeologists have found what may be the ancient city of Troy. That potentially adds credibility to the claim that there really was a war between Troy and Greece. Does that make us more inclined to believe that Achilles was the son of a goddess, and he fought the river god Scamander on the battlefield? It shouldn't. Even if we had a lot more evidence than we have, backing up all kinds of details from the Iliad, if we had the armor of Patroclus, and the sword of Achilles, and scraps of wood from the Trojan horse, that would establish a historical basis for the Iliad, but it would do nothing to back up Homer's theological claims. We would say very reasonably, the realistic parts are true, and all the stuff about gods and goddesses is an added layer of legend. Let it suffice to say, there isn't anything like that kind of physical evidence for any story in the Bible. We know that many of the towns and cities mentioned in the Bible really existed. Some of the battles that are mentioned may really have taken place, but we have no idea if they actually happened the way they were described in the Bible. At best, the biblical accounts may reflect historical memory overlaid with myth and legend, just like Homer's Iliad. Mr. Calvo argues that
atheists who deny Christ continue to use Christ's name, saying Jesus Christ when they die in a video game. It's just about undeniably evident that the person proclaiming the name is acknowledging his being, but because they reject him, they do so by cursing him.
this is so obvious that it seems almost silly to say it out loud. But we say things like, oh God, and oh Jesus, and Jesus Christ, because it is part of our culture. We were raised in a culture that has been saying these things for hundreds of years. And we learned these expressions the way we learned all the other expressions in English, by imitating others. Because a lot of people believe in Jesus, the name has a lot of cultural currency. When you use it, people understand you're expressing a strong emotion. It doesn't matter if you personally think Jesus is important. His name already has that meaning attached to it in the culture. That's how language works. And finally, prophecy. Calvo claims that
biblical scripture contains around 2,500 different prophecies that predict future events. As many as 2,000 of those prophecies had already been fulfilled without error. That is already 80%. The odds that 2,000 distinct prophecies could have been filled without any errors at all is less than 1 in 10 to the 2,000th power. That is 2,000 zeros written after the 10. That is remarkable.
I have no idea where these figures come from. I guess someone made a list of 2,500 biblical prophecies and the 2,000 that they think were fulfilled, but Mr. Calvo gives 0 examples in this chapter. He gives 5 examples in chapter 6, and a bunch more in chapter 10, which we will get to later, but he doesn't give the slightest hint as to where the 2000 number comes from. We will get to the examples, but first, the math. Calvo doesn't show his work, but he appears to be saying that the probability of any series of events equals 10 to the power of how many events you're talking about. 2,000 prophecies, 10 to the power of 2,000. This is clearly nonsense. There couldn't be a generic formula to calculate the probability of making accurate predictions. It depends on what you're predicting. If you predict that it will rain in a particular place on a particular day, the probability will be 20% or 30% or 50% or whatever, depending on what the usual weather is in that area. If you predict that it will rain somewhere, sometime, you have a 100% chance of being correct. So the question is, what kind of predictions are we talking about here? Are they predicting specific events that we can verify? Like, it will rain in London on April 2nd at 4 p.m.? Or are they general statements like, it will rain? Let's look at the 5 examples from chapter 6. And Jesus answered and said unto them, Take heed that no man deceives you, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. The claim here is that people will lie and say that they're the Messiah. Well, sure. During the time of Jesus, there were already a lot of people claiming that. Jesus was one of many would-be messiahs in first century Palestine. So this is just him saying, don't believe the other guys, I'm the real deal. Not only does this not specify a time or place, it doesn't involve a prediction at all.
And ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines, and pestilences, and earthquakes in diverse places.
Okay, so this perfectly matches what we said before. It's a totally mundane, unimpressive prediction, like it will rain. There will be wars, there will be famines, there will be earthquakes. Yes, there will be, because there always are.
Then they shall deliver you up to be afflicted, and shall kill you, and ye shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake.
So this is Calvo's opportunity to complain that Christians are being persecuted.
Christians are unjustly beaten and judged for sharing the word and love of God. Christians being falsely accused of hurting and abusing others. The world is in conviction of their sin and are monstrously angry when exposed.
Have Christians been persecuted for their beliefs? Sure. And so have Muslims, Jews, Buddhists, Hindus, and almost any other religious group I can think of. Christians have also taken their turn persecuting others, as I mentioned in my last video. The idea that Christians are being singled out for persecution is not only false, it is a paranoid delusion. You're talking about the dominant religion on this part of the planet, a religion that exercised near total control over European societies for over 1,000 years. Now that this near total control is loosening up a bit, people are just beginning to have the freedom to be non-Christian. People like Calvo want to paint Christians as victims? This is totally absurd.
And many false prophets shall rise, and shall deceive many. And because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold.
Here Calvo rants about the evil practices he counts as iniquity, including same-sex marriage, transgenderism, people not saying God in the Pledge of Allegiance, abortion, blah, blah, blah. Is it not clear that he's just plugging in his own modern-day concerns and claiming that's what the Bible meant by iniquity? Jesus said nothing about same-sex marriage or abortion or the Pledge of Allegiance. The fact that you can point to these things and call them fulfillment of prophecy shows that this is a totally generic prediction and could have been fulfilled by anything. Also, this is a bit off topic, but It's telling that when Calvo wants examples of modern-day iniquity, it doesn't occur to him to talk about child labor, human trafficking, modern-day slavery. This isn't authentic concern for the freedom and safety and dignity of all human beings. This is just a lazy recitation of the conservative positions in the culture war. If you're so worried about two gay people getting married that you need to put that on your short list of evil practices, fine, I guess, but keep Jesus' name out of your mouth when you do it. Jesus never spoke about this, so it's sleazy and dishonest to use him as an excuse for your gay bashing. Getting back to the point, you don't need to be a prophet to say there will be bad stuff in the world. There was iniquity in the time of Jesus, and there was iniquity in all the centuries before Jesus, and there's been iniquity in every century since. So where's the prediction? The last so-called prophecy cited in chapter 6 is,
"There will be terrible times in the last days. People will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, proud, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, without love, unforgiving, slanderous,"
and the list goes on and on. I'll just say one last time, this is not a prediction. People are boastful, proud, abusive, all of these things. They always have been. Our example of a non-prophecy was to say it will rain without specifying a time and place. But even that would be more prophetic than this. This is like standing outside and predicting rain while it's raining on your head. That's it for this very long video. I just want to say one more thing. As I've been giving shout outs to other YouTube channels that are discussing similar topics, I should acknowledge the YouTuber called Logicked. He's the one whose videos first brought Almando Calvo to my attention, so this video series would not exist without him. He has started his own video series on a conscious universe, and I highly recommend it. That link can also be found in the description. Till next time.